Mr. Strindberg. Here it is, 1884, and you've gone and written another novel.
Yes, my friend, that's the sad truth. I know I shall be severely punished for it, but I couldn't stop myself.
But isn't it inconsistent of you to attack the writing of novels and then go and write a novel yourself? Don't you agree?
Oh, I agree.
You agree, sir? You agree that you're inconsistent?
Of course I do. Like everything else in creation, I am subject to the laws of evolution, and it is through our relapses that we advance. But you mustn't be angry with me because of it. In a couple of years, I shall stop producing novels and plays and poetry. That is, if I can.
And what will you turn to then, sir?
Well, I'm thinking of becoming an interviewer. Yes, I'm serious. You see, I've got tired of trying to guess what people mean, especially when they write books. I want to do what you do. Go and ask them. But back to business. What do you think of my new book, Getting Married?
Well, first of all, I think it's badly constructed. It's incomplete.
Oh, if only you knew how right you are. It is incomplete. That is just what I intended it to be. I wanted to describe quite a number of situations, normal situations, in the relationship between men and women, not exceptional situations, nor, like Ibsen, monstrous situation, which is then taken as the norm for all situations.
Yes. Sir, but as I said before, your book is incomplete. Moreover, it's immoral. Don't you agree?
Yes, I do, in the sense in which you use the word, for if morality is a crime against nature, then my book is immoral, for it is modeled upon nature.
But thirdly, sir, your book's reactionary. You, sir, a known liberal, have allowed yourself to make fun of the woman question. How could you dare to do that?
Oh, I admit that to make fun of a fashionable absurdity requires greater courage than to allow your wife to be carried along with the stream.
Do you call the woman question absurd, sir?
Yes, I regard it as just as criminal to want to free woman from the laws of nature as it would be to try to do the same to man. I beg you to observe that the attempt to liberate woman in present day 1884 is a revolt against nature, which will bring its own punishment. But in my preface, you will find out exactly what I think on the subject. Here it is, and I have asked some of my colleagues of mine to help me present this to you. The woman question, upon which the foundations of our society are said to rest, seems to me to be overrated. The woman question only concerns the cultured woman, a clip representing perhaps 10% of the population. But anything done by the cultured classes is always heralded by so much noise that it soon appears to concern the whole of humanity. Among the population of the country as a whole, or among the agricultural workers, the woman question has been solved. Learn by their example.
The countryman and his wife have the same education. If the one can write, then the other can reckon. They share the work between them without dividing it in detail, as the cultured classes do, so that each plays the part indicated by nature. And the one is not master of a subject the other does not understand. For this reason, theirs is a tolerably satisfactory spiritual marriage.
The countryman's wife cannot envy her husband his free status, for it is no more honorable to store the manure heap than it is to stir the pot. On the whole, it is pleasanter to sit in the warm house than it is to work the muddy ditch with the sun on your back, or to work in up to your armpits in icy sludge to haul a fishing net. If the husband has charge of the small quantity of money that comes into the house,
the wife has the keys of the flour bin and the larder. The money she earns by spinning during the winter evenings, she may keep as petty cash.
Now, the stronger always rules, whether he be man or woman. A farmer's wife is seldom unfaithful, partly because she is too busy, and partly because the unmarried lads have girls to interest them. The farmers are seldom unfaithful, as the girls don't make up to a gaffer when they are allowed to mix freely with boys.
Characters of men and women living in a natural state are much the same, since during pregnancy, woman is less able to defend herself. And since she needs food and protection for her children after they are born, she has placed herself under the care of man.
This does not mean that the man has subjugated her. He loves her as his wife and the mother of his children. And the respect that any man, including the countryman, shows a woman stems from the fact that he was brought up by a woman, his mother.
The woman is always first and foremost the mother.
Look at the old granny sitting by the fireside and notice how she always treats the father of the family as if he were a boy.
Now, the cultured woman, on the other hand, has been corrupted exactly the same way as the cultured man. Love between cultured couples is a very, very complicated affair, and at its root lies the impulse to propagate the family. When the community began to demand security for the child and invented matrimony, and when possessions and social standing followed in its train, natural feelings were forced into the background and were branded by the upper classes as sensuality.
which must be concealed under a cloak of gallantry. When a man sought a wife, he had to hide under the cloak his interest in being allied to a good family, in winning property, and the like.
When after marriage the mask was dropped, woman regards herself as cheated.
And many unhappy marriages were the result.
For a man, the period of an engagement is a time when he must practice all the skills of a lackey, which the extra work that marriage involves will prevent him from exercising later.
The wife will feel the loss of her lackey,
And will find she now has an equal.
but she will think he is a tyrant.
Now, what are the true facts about the married man's tyranny? A man chooses his wife and is usually in love with her. The difficulties of getting married intensify his expectations of absolute bliss, so as a rule, he will suffer disappointment. He will find that his angel is a human being, and his miscalculation will put him in a bad temper.
But he loves her.
In most cases, the wife rules within the house and the husband outside it. This is not disadvantageous to her.
She engages the maids. She decides what the family is to eat and how the children are to be brought up. She also usually holds the purse strings. In most cases, the husband hands over his income to his wife and gives her pocket money, which she may spend without being obliged to say how.
He himself has to notify her of every cent he wants to spend on cigars and punch,
Thus, the wife cannot be regarded as a slave.
nor the husband a tyrant.
Now, the reasons for an unhappy marriage are many. The first lies in the nature of marriage itself. Two human beings, and what is more, beings of the opposite sex, are incautious enough to promise to stick together for the rest of their lives. Thus, marriage is based on an impossibility.
One partner develops in one direction, the other in another, and their marriage breaks up.
Or one of the two remains stationary while the other develops and they drift apart.
Incompatibility between husband and wife may arise when two strong spirits clash and realize that no compromise is possible unless one partner gives way.
Then, too, there are cases when so-called infidelity separates a couple.
The love between doves have been praised by the poets, and they certainly mate for life. But if one partner is wounded or defective, love takes flight, and the other seeks a new mate. This is indeed very unpoetic, and therefore no poet has dared to tell us the truth about the celebrated love of doves for fear of angering the ladies.
Now, since marriage, which is a human institution invented for purely practical purposes, is so frail and so full of stumbling blocks, how is it that so many marriages hold together?
They do so because both partners have one interest in common, the thing for which nature has always intended marriage, namely children.
A marriage without children is a sad affair and is not a marriage at all.
But now comes the great unfathomable question.
Is it the duty of the individual to surrender his individuality from the moment he reproduces himself?
And live only for his children?
Is the position of women really what nature intended it to be?
Is not her long term of motherhood a martyrdom?
What are her attempts to free herself so very contrary to nature?
Now, among the larger mammals that live as long as man, motherhood lasts for 1 or 2 years. As a result of civilization, the female of the human species is, practically speaking, tied for life. Consequently, her apparent opposition to nature is really an opposition to culture, just another stumbling block of marriage. To fully illustrate the salient points I have made in my preface, my most talented colleagues will present a few examples from my novel. Let us begin with an attempt at reform, shall we?
She had noticed.
With such disgust, the way in which girls were brought up to be housekeepers to their future husbands, she had therefore learnt a trade by which she would be able to support herself under all possible circumstances.
She could make artificial flowers. He had noticed.
With pain that girls sat about waiting to be kept by their future husbands. He wanted to marry a free, independent woman who could support herself. Then he would be able to regard her as his equal and have a comrade for life, not a housekeeper.
Fate willed that they should meet.
He was a painter.
An artist.
And she,
As I said,
made flowers.
and it was in Paris that they had picked up those new ideas. Theirs was a marriage in good taste. They had rented 3 rooms in Passy. Their studio was in the middle.
His room was on one side of it.
And hers on the other.
They were not going to share a bed.
A beastly idea.
That had not the remotest counterpart in nature.
And which only gave rise to excesses and disorderliness.
Fancy having to undress in the same room? Ah!
No, indeed.
A room each and a neutral room in common.
The studio.
No servants.
For they would do the cooking together. Just an old woman who would come in the morning and evening.
It was all carefully calculated and rightly conceived.
But what if you have children? Inquired the doubters.
We're not going to have any children.
Bon, they were not going to have any children. It was delightful. He went down to the market in the morning and did the shopping. After that, he made the coffee.
She swept and made the beds and tidied up. Then they sat down to work. When they got tired of this, they chatted for a while,
gave each other a bit of advice,
laughed.
and enjoyed themselves.
As dinner time drew near, he lit the stove.
And she cleaned the vegetables,
He saw to the pot of fur.
while she ran down to the grocer's. Then she laid the table,
While he dished up.
But they did not live as brother and sister. They said good night in the evening, and they each went to their own room. Then would come a knock at her door, and she would say,
Come in.
but the bed was narrow, and there was never any nonsense. They each woke up in the morning in their own bed, and then there'd be a knocking on the walls.
"Good morning, my pet. How are you today?"
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Their meeting in the morning was always new.
And it never grew stale.
People thought it was an ideal marriage. They had never seen such a happy couple. But the girl had parents who lived a long way off. In their letters, they constantly asked if Leeson wasn't expecting yet, for they were longing so much to have a grandchild. Leeson must remember that marriage was created for the sake of children, not for the parents.
Leeson told them that their ideas were old-fashioned.
Whereupon her mother asked if they intended to exterminate the human race with their newfangled notions.
Leeson had not thought of this, but it did not worry her, for she was happy.
And so was her husband.
And now the world had at last seen a happy marriage.
And consequently, it was jealous.
What fun they had.
Neither was the other's master.
And they went shares on the expenses.
Sometimes he earned more.
And sometimes she did.
So things evened up in the end.
Then there were the birthdays.
She would wake up to find a bouquet of flowers with a little sheet of notebook paper with flowers painted on it, which was written, Mrs. Rosebud's daughter wishes her many happy returns and invites her to a tip-top breakfast in his room. Ready now?
Then she'd knock on his door.
Come in.
And they'd have breakfast in bed.
His bed. And she would stay there for the whole morning.
It was delightful.
And it never grew stale, and it lasted for 2 years.
And all the prophets were proved wrong, and that's what marriage should be like.
Then something happened. The young wife became ill.
She thought it was the wallpaper.
But he suggested bacteria.
Yes, of course, it must be bacteria.
But something else was wrong too.
Things were definitely not as they should be.
It must be a chill.
But she was getting so fat.
Could it be that she had one of those growths you hear so much about?
Yes, it must be a growth.
She went to a doctor, and when she got home, she wept.
Because it really was a growth.
But one which would emerge in the daylight in due course and turn into a flower and set seeds, it too. Her husband did not weep.
He thought it was stunning.
And would you believe it? The wretch went about boasting about it in town.
But his wife wept again.
Oh, what would happen now to their relationship? She wouldn't be able to earn anything now. She'd have to live on him.
They'd have to have a maid too.
Oh, those maids.
All their planning, all their prudence, all their foresight had gone aground on the inescapable. But mother-in-law wrote enthusiastic letters of congratulation and repeated time after time that God had created marriage for the sake of the children and that the parents' pleasure was only a side issue.
Hugo swore that he would never give a thought to the fact that she didn't earn anything. Wouldn't she contribute quite enough to their home by the work she did for his child? And wasn't that also worth money? What was money but work? That meant she'd be paying her share.
All the same, the thought that she'd be living on him nagged for a long time. But when the child arrived, she forgot all about it. She was his wife and his comrade, just as she had been.
But she was also the mother of his child.
And to him, that was best of all.
When the fish were playing and the cockbirds beginning to sing, the children of man went out to their playgrounds to find mates. Mothers decked out young females to entice the males.
Dressmakers sewed wadding into bodices.
And tailors put pads into jackets and frock coats.
And then out they went into nature to choose surroundings suitable for the natural act for which they were preparing. One was the seaside.
There it was that the businessman's wife came with her daughter.
And the lieutenant with his uniform.
And his debts. And one evening, while the midges danced and the cats caterwauled,
The girls danced too, in the ballroom of the assembly rooms. They had cut their tops of their dresses low and ordered the blinds to be drawn so that the light could shine down on them.
And the lieutenant bent over the businessman's daughter in a window recess.
and his eyes asked, "Will you pay my debts?"
But his lips said, "Will you love me for better or for worse?"
And the businessman's daughter answered with her eyes, "Yes, if you will make me a countess and introduce me to your grand friends, and if you will let papa play cards with your generals, and mama call your countesses by their Christian names, and if you will keep me until death us do part, and let me enjoy myself."
Yes, he would.
And so the bargain was struck. Well, 2 years had passed. They were sitting in their dressing gowns, listless, bored, exchanging a few home truths.
"Wadding," he said, pointing to the puffed-out dress that hung over the back of a chair.
"Wadding," she answered, and pointed her slipper at his riding coat that dangled from the towel rail.
He pulled his dressing gown closer round him and did not answer. 2 years later, the businessman went bankrupt.
Well, that put an end to the card playing with generals that he had been promised.
And the countesses broke off relationships with his wife.
The lieutenant developed a taste for private life in the home, especially as the subsidies from his father-in-law were no longer forthcoming. One day, when he had been particularly truthful to his countess,
The latter found herself obliged to deal with the matter in detail. "Now that I'm poor, you're not as polite as you used to be."
"Well, I wasn't polite before either, so it's not a case of you being poor."
"Yes, but you were more polite to papa before."
"Certainly, because he had one merit. He was rich. Now that he's lost that estimable quality, I see no reason to show him any exaggerated marks of respect."
"So you admit it, quite crudely, that you married me for money."
"Of course. Isn't it nice of me to own up to being myself?"
And you're not ashamed to talk to me like that.
Oh, yes, I am. But surely you're not trying to make me believe that you married me for, what do they call it? Love? I'm much more inclined to think that you paid my miserable debt of 10,000 crowns in exchange for the title of Countess. It was a good bargain. Dickinson had to give a couple of 100,000 for the privilege of becoming a mere member of nobility, and Smith had to pay 6,000 for the Order of Vaza. I haven't cheated you over the deal, for you are a countess. But you've cheated me. For you hung out a rich father-in-law, and here I am with a poor one. wadding, all from beginning to end.
Yes, but I didn't just marry you for money.
No, for a title. And it comes to the same thing.
Go on, please. A man with the courage to make way with a poor woman's money, he'll stop at nothing.
Listen to me, my little chick.
I am not a chick.
You contributed 10,000 crowns. But do you know what I've spent during the past 4 years? 40,000. Your father coughed up another 5. That should tell you just how much of the poor lieutenant's money you've made away with, shouldn't it?
Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Perhaps a wife's expected to keep her husband these days.
Oh, but she shouldn't accuse her husband of making away with her money when they've used it up together. And anyhow, what do you mean by her money? Where did that money come from? Had she earned it? None of you have any business to talk about money when it's all that you marry for.
Are you trying to tell me that you kept me as you might any other kept woman?
There's no need for me to say it, as you've admitted it to yourself. However, it's just as well that you have, for if you want to hear the truth of the matter, we shall have to change our way of life after what's happened. Wouldn't you like to seize the opportunity to liberate yourself, to emancipate yourself from the humiliation of eating the bread of charity?
Indeed, I should.
Do it then. Work.
I've never learned to do anything.
Do what you can. Look after your house.
That is not work.
How right you are. In that case, you'll just have to go on doing nothing. That's the role allotted to you by society.
A splendid role.
So you admit it now, do you?
Yes, I admit it. I'm doomed until I die to eat a man's bread. When my father couldn't keep me any longer, my mother took me to market to find someone that could.
Yes, and she found me. I boosted your father's credit and probably procured him many times as much as he spent on me. That's how matters stand now. What do you want me to do about it?
Nothing.
No. I can't see that there's anything that can be done. It's the same all along the line. A hollow sham. Wadding, every bit of it.
The lieutenant became peevish and his wife miserable. After 2 years of it, they got a divorce.
And the lieutenant was ordered to pay his wife alimony for life.
Yes, it's an expensive business, that is, said the captain one day as they were dining at the restaurant.
What is legitimate is always expensive, said the lieutenant. But it's also so dear, one ought to at least be able to have it on approval, to be returned, if not satisfactory.
She was plain. Consequently, she was overlooked by the raw young men who cannot appreciate a beautiful soul under plain exterior.
But she was rich. and she knew that men hanker after the wealth owned by females.
Whether this was because all wealth was created by men,
which makes them think that capital belongs to their sex,
or whether there was some other less well-founded reason she never discovered. As she was rich, she always treated men with great mistrust and contempt. She was regarded as a gifted woman. Her mother was still alive, and she did not want to wait the 5 years that must elapse before she would be able to do what she liked with her fortune.
So one day, her friends were surprised to receive cards announcing her engagement.
She's getting married to have a husband, said some.
No, she's getting married to have a footman and her freedom, said others.
How silly of her to get married. Didn't she realize that it would turn her into a minor for the first time in her life?
What did he look like?
Was he?
Where had she picked him up?
He was a young barrister with a shy manner. He was an only son and had been brought up by his mother and an aunt.
He had always been very much afraid of women.
And hated lieutenants, as they were so manly and always took precedence at balls and soirees.
They met at a ball.
He had arrived late, and when he went up to the ladies to ask for a dance,
They triumphantly answered no.
And waved their full dance programs at him as if they were waving away an impertinent fly.
Hurt and humbled, he went and sat down by himself on the veranda. Through the window, he could see couple after couple twirling by in the ballroom,
while the sensuous rhythm of the waltz made him tremble with jealousy.
Why, my dear judge, is it you sitting here dreaming?
Said a voice.
And not dancing?
Why aren't you dancing yourself?
Oh, because I'm so plain that no one will have me.
He looked at her. They were old acquaintances, but he had never studied her features. No one will have me either. But the lieutenants have right on their side. When it comes to natural selection, the stronger and the handsomer are always in the right. Look at their shoulders and their epaulets.
Hi, what a way to talk.
Forgive me, but an unequal fight makes one bitter. Will you dance with me, I wonder?
Are you asking me out of pity?
Yes, for myself. Have you known what it is to be singled out, to be thrown over by fate, always to be the last?
Have I known? But it is not always the last who comes last in cases like this. Beauty isn't the only thing that matters in life. There are other qualities that are equally valuable.
What qualities do you rate highest in a man?
Kindness. That is a quality you so seldom find in a man.
Kindness and weakness often go together, and women usually love strength.
What sort of women? Well, brute strength has had its day, and those of us who have learnt to be more civilized should know better than to put muscular strength and brutality higher than kind-heartedness.
We should, I agree. But all the same, look at what's going on in there.
Noble feelings and an understanding heart are what I mean by true manliness.
Do you mean that you would be able to respect a man whom the whole world calls a weakling, a mouse?
What do I care for the world and what it says?
Do you know that you are an unusual woman? Said the judge, who was becoming increasingly interested in her.
Not unusual at all. But you men are so used to thinking of women as playthings.
What men? I've looked up to women ever since I was a child. To me, they are a higher order of being. And the day a woman comes to love me and I her, I shall be her slave.
You are an unusual man, I must say.
After they had continued for some time to tell each other that they were unusual specimens of the miserable male species,
and poured out the sentiments about the frivolity of dancing.
and reflected upon the melancholy nature of the moon.
He went inside.
Adele was an excellent dancer.
And the judge won her heart completely as he danced like an innocent girl.
When the dance was over, they returned to the veranda.
What is love? Asked Adele.
Looking at the moon, as if she expected the heavens to answer her.
It is souls in sympathy,
Whispered the judge in a voice that seemed to come from the wind.
But sympathy can easily turn into antipathy. I've seen that happen before, replied Adele.
Well, then it wasn't true sympathy. Should I come to love a woman, she would not need to be beautiful. Beauty fades. I should see in her a good comrade, a friend, and I should never feel shy with her. I should go straight up to her as I do to you and say, will you be my friend for life?
Adele looked with rapture at the young man who had seized her hand.
You have an ideal character, and your words come from my own heart. If I understand you all right, you have asked for my friendship. You shall have it. But first I want to test you. Will you show me that you can suffer humiliation, scorn for the person you say you are fond of?
Need you ask? Tell me, and I shall obey.
Adele unclasped her necklace of chased gold from which hung a locket.
Wear this as a seal of our friendship.
I will wear it,
answered the judge, rather hesitantly.
But perhaps there will be people who will say that we are engaged.
And that frightens you?
No, not if that is what you want. Do you?
Yes, Axel, I do. For the world does not allow men and women to be friends. The world is such a vile place that it cannot believe that a pure relationship between people of opposite sexes is possible.
He wore his chain.
The world, a very materialistic place in private, said what her woman friends had said.
She's out to get married.
And he's out to get her.
It even dropped some ugly hints that he was marrying her for her money.
Especially as he himself had declared that nothing so love existed between them.
But friendship doesn't force people to use the same bedroom as married couples usually do.
They got married. The world had been given a hint that they intended to live as brother and sister.
And the world sneered wickedly.
And waited to see what would come of the great reform that was going to transform marriage.
The newlyweds went abroad.
The newlyweds came home.
She was pale and in bad temper.
The world smelt a rat and expected the worst.
The judge looked as if he'd been up to no good and went about with a hangdog air.
The conclusions drawn were as follows.
These two have been bundling, said the world.
That brother and sister are going to have a child, said her women friends.
And without love. But that's...
Yes, what was it?
The forbidden degree, said the materialist.
Either this is a spiritual marriage or it is incest, said an anarchist.
The fact remained. But the sympathy between souls began to dwindle. Despised reality broke in to take its revenge.
The judge pursued his calling.
His wife employed a wet nurse and a maid to pursue hers.
Consequently, she had nothing to do.
Idleness gave her thoughts a chance to develop, and she began to take stock of her position.
She found it decidedly unsatisfactory. Was doing nothing an occupation for an intelligent person?
No, doing nothing wasn't an occupation. Why didn't she feed the child herself?
Feed it? She wanted to be paid for what she did.
Why? Was she greedy? She had more money than she needed. What was the point of earning more?
To be on an equal footing with him.
But they could never be on equal footing. She would always occupy a position he would never be able to reach. Nature had ordained that woman could become a mother, but that the man could not.
Yes, but the life she was living was intolerable. She couldn't live only for her family. She wanted to live for other people too.
Well, she might begin with her family, and she could always think of other people later on.
This conversation could well have gone on indefinitely.
As it was, it went on for quite a long time.
For most of the day, the judge was out visiting clients, and when he came home, he received others in his office.
This drove Adele frantic.
He saw him closeted with other women who told him their troubles, about which he could tell her nothing. There were always secrets to divide them, and she felt that he was above her. A dull hatred began to grow in her.
Hatred for the injustice of the relationship.
She never said what was going on in her burning brain.
But her husband was made to feel the effects of it.
She began to suffer from delicate health.
She lost her appetite and refused to go out.
She got thin and began to cough.
After a time, her husband sent her to be overhauled by a doctor.
But the latter could find no reason for her illness.
Finally, her husband got so used to her constant complaints that he ceased to take any notice of them.
It's a bore having a sick wife, she said.
And he admitted to himself that it wasn't exactly pleasant.
But if he had loved her, he would never have felt nor admitted anything of the sort.
Her health deteriorated appreciably.
And at last, he agreed to let her have her way and consult the famous specialist.
Adele went to see him.
How long have you been ill?
Well, I've never been well since I gave up living in the country, which is where I was brought up.
Well, you don't like living in town, then?
Like? Who's going to bother about whether I like it or not?
Do you think country air would suit you?
To tell the truth, I believe it's the only thing that will save me.
Well, then go and live in the country.
But my husband can't give up his career for my sake.
Why not? He married a rich wife, and we have too many barristers as it is.
You mean, Doctor, that you would advise us to live in the country?
Yes, if you think it would do you good. I can't find anything wrong with you except for what is called nerves, and I think the country air would do you good.
Adele returned home very downcast.
Well?
The specialist had said she would die if she went on living in town.
The judge was beside himself.
But as he could not conceal that this was chiefly because he would have to give up his practice, she got the conclusive proof she needed that he was not in the least concerned about his wife's life.
Perhaps he didn't believe that her life was at stake.
But didn't he think that the specialist was better able to judge that than he was? Did he want her to die?
Of course he did not. So they bought an estate in the country.
A steward was employed to run it, and as there was already a policeman and a bailiff on the spot,
the judge had nothing to do. His days were interminably long, and he led a miserable life. He no longer had an income of his own and was forced to live on his wife's money.
His wife, on the other hand, immediately threw herself heart and soul into farming. She went into the cowshed herself with her skirts tucked up above her knees.
And came into the house dirty and smelling of cow.
She flourished exceedingly, and the way she ordered people about was a joy to behold, for she had been brought up in the country and she knew what she was about.
When the judge complained of his lack of occupation, she said sharply,
"Look after the children, that'll give you something to do."
He looked at her to see if she meant what she said.
Yes. Why shouldn't he look after his own children? Was there anything odd about that? And henceforth, she employed him as the nursemaid.
He performed his duties punctually. He could see nothing improper in the arrangement, but it irked him. Somehow it was the wrong way round.
But his wife always knew how to give things a twist that made it look right. The mistress was going away to an auction for 8 days, and the master was to keep an eye on the servants while she was away.
On the first day, the cook came to ask for money to buy sugar and coffee.
He gave her what she asked for.
3 days later, she came back again to ask for more money for the same purpose.
He expressed surprise that there was nothing left of what he had given her before.
I'm not the only one that eats it, and the mistress never passes any remarks.
He gave her the money. But as he wanted to see if he was mistaken, he opened the housekeeping book and began to do some addition. The figure he arrived at for those 2 items was remarkable. When he added up all the pounds used in a month, they came to a stone. In the ledger, he found not only the most enormous totals, but also the most preposterous mistakes in addition. The conclusion he came to was that his wife had not mastered compound addition or decimal fractions, and that scandalous cheating by the servants would certainly ruin the family before long.
The mistress of the house returned.
The judge was made to listen to her stories of the auction right to the end. Then he cleared his throat and was about to start,
When the lady herself picked up the thread. Well, and how have you been getting on with the servants, old man?
Oh, I've been getting on all right with them, but I'm sure they're not honest.
Not honest?
No, take the entries for coffee and sugar. They're much too big.
How do you know?
I looked them up in your housekeeping book.
Did you indeed? So you've been prying into my books?
Prying? No. I thought it would be amusing to look them over.
What business are they of yours?
And I discovered that you keep accounts without knowing how to do compound addition or fractions.
What's that? Do you mean to say that I can't?
No, you can't, and consequently the whole position of the family is being undermined. You're a little humbug, old girl. That's what you are.
Who cares what my books look like?
Well, my dear, the law can put somebody, probably me, in prison for falsifying the accounts.
The law? Rubbish. I don't care a fig for the law.
I dare say you don't, but it will keep a sharp eye on us all the same. That is to say, on me. Consequently, I intend to keep the books myself in the future.
We can employ a bookkeeper.
Quite unnecessary. I've nothing else to do.
So that was that.
But when the judge took his seat at the desk and the servants came under his supervision,
his wife began to lose interest in farming and dairy work. A violent reaction set in, and very soon she had given up caring about either cows or calves, but simply stayed indoors. There she sat and brooded, and new ideas began to ferment in her mind.
The judge, on the other hand, awoke to a new life. He threw himself into farming and stirred up the farm laborers. He had the upper hand now. He managed everyone and everything, authorized payments and ordered supplies.
One day, his wife came into the office and asked for 1,000 crowns for a new piano.
Whatever are you thinking of? Just when we're intending to rebuild the cowshed, we can't afford it.
Well, what do you mean by that? We can't afford it? Well, then what's become of all my money?
Your money?
Yes, my money. The money I brought to our marriage.
The minute you married, that money passed to the family.
To you, you mean?
No, my friend, to the family. The family is a little community, the only one acknowledged to own everything in common, and where the property is usually managed by the husband.
Why should he manage it and not his wife?
Because he has more time and he doesn't have to bear children.
Why can't they both manage it?
For the same reason that a company only had one managing director. If the wife were allowed to manage the property, the children would have to be allowed to do so too, as it's also their property.
Oh, that's only legal quibbling. But I think it's pretty hard that I should have to ask leave to buy a piano with my own money.
The money isn't yours any longer.
Is it yours then?
No, it's not mine either. It belongs to the family.
When shall we see the day on which a woman will be allowed to manage her own property and not have to beg from her husband?
Works herself. It was a man, your father, who created your wealth by work. All wealth is created by men, and therefore, you see, the law whereby a sister inherited less than a brother was a just one. For the brother was born with the duty of providing for a wife, while the sister was under no obligation to provide for her husband. Do you follow me?
Yes, you're saying it's justice to share out unequally. But is it justice? Can you, with all your intelligence, say that it is? Surely things should always be divided into equal parts.
Not always. Things should be divided according to deserts. The lazy man who lies on the grass and watches the bricklayer build should not have more than the bricklayer.
Oh, indeed. So you're saying I'm lazy? What do you want me to do then?
Take the children out.
Looking after children doesn't suit me.
But it had to suit me. Listen, my little friend. A woman who says that looking after children doesn't suit her isn't a woman. She's not a man either. Can you tell me what she is?
Fie for shame. How can you say such things to the mother of your children?
What is said of a man who isn't interested in women? Something pretty ugly, isn't it?
Oh, I won't listen to any more.
So she left the room and shut herself up.
She fell ill.
The doctor declared that country air and solitude were unhealthy, and that they would have to move to the city so that Madame could have proper medical care.
The city had a very good effect on Madame's health, and the air of the gutters brought new color to her cheeks.
The judge built up a practice.
And the couple found safety valves for their irreconcilable temperaments.
One day, the newspaper announced that there was going to be a play by the wife that was going to be performed at the theater.
Now you see, don't you, that a woman can have higher aims in life than rocking a cradle and cooking.
Play was performed.
The husband sat in a box
and felt as if he were under a cold shower.
And when the play was over, he had to act as host at the supper party.
Madame was surrounded by admirers.
And her husband had to pour out drinks for them.
And cut their cigars.
Now he was the underdog and found it extremely unpleasant.
When they got home that night, she was radiant. Her whole soul had expanded and filled every artery, tensed every nerve. Success had lifted the stones from her breast, and she could breathe freely and deeply. She had spoken, and she had been heard. She had been dumb, and she had regained the power of speech. She was ecstatic about the future, about new plans, new conquests.
Her husband sat as silent as a block of wood that had no resonance.
The higher she rose, the lower he sank.
You're jealous, she said.
Stopping in the middle of an impassioned speech.
If I weren't your husband, I shouldn't be. I'm happy about your success, but it obliterates me. You're right, but I'm right too. Marriage is cannibalism. If I don't eat you, you'll eat me. You have eaten me. I can't love you any longer.
Have you ever loved me?
No, you're right. We built our marriage without love, and consequently, it didn't work. In any case, it seems to me as if marriage plays the same role as the monarchy. Monarchy can only survive if it is autocratic. Marriage is a monarchical form of government, and therefore it must die.
What should we have in its place then?
A republic, of course, answered her husband, and went to bed.
They had been married for many years.
Happily?
As happily as circumstances allowed.
Their pulls had been evenly matched, as evenly as those of two steers of equal strength pulling the opposite ends of a rope. During the first year, of course, they discarded a host of illusions about marriage as a state of absolute bliss.
During the second year, their children were born, and the drudgery of their life did not leave them much time for brooding.
He was very domesticated.
Perhaps too much so.
His family was his little world.
He was its central point, and his children were the radii.
His wife, too, tried to be a central point.
Oh, but never the one in the center of the circle, for there sat her husband.
Consequently, the radii sometimes crossed each other.
Or fell outside each other, and there was friction in the house.
After many years of marriage, the husband was appointed secretary to the prison inspectorate and had to travel about the country.
This was a blow to his domestic habits, and the thought that he would have to be away from his family for a whole month made him thoroughly miserable. He did not know for sure whether it was his wife or his children he would miss the most.
Maybe it was both? On the evening before his departure, he is sitting on the sofa watching his wife pack his portmanteau.
She is on her knees on the floor, putting in his linen. She brushes his black clothes and folds them carefully so that they will take up as little room as possible.
He would not have known how.
She had never regarded herself as his servant, hardly even as his wife.
She was mother. Mother to the children, mother to him. He never felt humiliated by darning his socks, and she never expected to be thanked for doing so. She never thought that he never owed her anything for what she did, for in return he gave her and the children new stockings and many other things,
which she would otherwise have had to scrape together by working outside her home while her children were left alone.
Now,
he sat and watched her.
As the moment of parting approached, he began to draw out in advance small sums of regret. He looked at her figure. Her shoulder blades protruded a little, and her back was bent from leaning over the cradle, the ironing board, and the kitchen stove. He, too, was bent from leaning over his desk, and his eyes could not see without help. But now he was not thinking about himself. He saw that her braids were not as thick as they had been, and that at her parting, the skin showed through.
Was it for him that she had lost her beauty? For him alone?
No, it was for the little community formed by them all, for she had worked for herself as well. He, too, had struggled for all of them, and his hair, too, had thinned on top. Perhaps his youth would have lasted longer if there had not been so many mouths, if he had been alone. But not for an instant did he wish he had been.
It will do you good to get away for a bit. You've sat moping at home for too long.
You'll be glad to get rid of me, my dear, but I'm sure I shall miss you all.
Oh, you're like a cat. You'll miss your warm corner. But don't tell me you'll miss me all that much.
And what about the children?
Oh, why, yes, when you're away. But when you're at home, you nag at them. Not seriously, but you do. Oh, well, you love them, I'm sure. I won't be unfair to you.
He was feeling more sentimental than he cared to show.
And the disorder of the room was making him very uneasy. He saw bits and pieces of his daily life,
of his very existence,
thrown higgledy-piggledy on chairs and bureaus, and the black portmanteau, thrown wide open, gaped at him like a coffin. The following morning, an August morning, he jumped out of bed, dressed with his heart in his mouth, and was altogether very much on edge.
He kissed all the children, and then after embracing his wife, got into the cab that was to take him to the station.
The journey, in the company of the superintendent, distracted him.
And he began to feel that it was a good thing to be shaken up a bit. He had left his home behind him like a stuffy bedroom, and by the time he got to their destination, he was in a really happy frame of mind.
What remained of the day was spent having a grand dinner party at the prison,
At which they drank to the health of the Lord Lieutenant.
but not of the prisoners.
Though those were in fact the object of their journey.
But after that came the evening in his solitary room, a bed, 2 chairs, a table, a washstand, and a candle which shed a meager light on the bare wallpaper.
It made the secretary feel anxious. Everything was lacking. His slippers, his dressing gown, his pipe rack, his desk, and all the trifles which he had allowed to become the ingredients of his life.
And what about the children and his wife?
How were they now?
Were they well?
He grew very restless and very low-spirited, and when he wanted to wind his watch, he could not find the key. It must be at home, hanging on the watchstand that his wife had embroidered for him when they were engaged.
He got into bed and lay thinking about the past and about his wife.
A bygone image stepped forth, and he experienced an acute sense of loss. Every sharp word that he had uttered since those days cut into his ear, and he regretted all the bitter moments he must have caused her.
At last he fell asleep.
The following day, work. And another dinner party with a toast for the director.
But still, nothing for the prisoners.
In the evening, solitude, desolation, cold.
He felt a need to talk to his wife, so he got out some notepaper and sat down at the table. But before he had pinned a stroke, he paused. How was he to begin?
Dear Mama was what he always wrote when he sent home a note to say he would be eating out.
But now he wasn't writing to Mama. He was writing to his former fiancée, to his mistress. So he wrote, Lily, my darling, as he had done of old.
It was slow work to begin with, for so many beautiful words had dropped out of the dry language they used in their humdrum daily life.
But he soon warmed to the task, and they rose to the surface like forgotten melodies, waltz rhythms.
Snatches of romances.
Lilacs and swallows.
Evening hours at sunset on waters smooth as glass.
All the springtime memories of their life danced out like sunlit clouds.
At the bottom, he drew a star, as lovers do, and beside it he wrote, just as of old, kiss here.
When he had finished and reread his letter, he noticed that he felt in some way embarrassed.
Why?
He wasn't quite sure, but he felt he'd been pouring out his most intimate feelings to someone who perhaps would not understand.
All the same, he dispatched the letter.
He had to wait 2 days for an answer.
And while he waited, he felt childish, shy, worried.
Then it arrived.
He had struck the right note.
And out of the kitchen fumes and the nursery hubbub rose a song that was as clear and sweet, as warm and pure as first love.
Now an interchange of love letters began.
He wrote every evening and was quite capable of sending a postcard during the course of the day.
His colleagues did not recognize him as the same man. The fact that he had begun to take an interest in his clothes and his appearance, and of course they suspected him of having a love affair.
True, he had fallen in love all over again.
He sent her a photograph without spectacles.
And she sent him a lock of hair.
Oh, they used childish expressions to each other.
And he bought colored writing paper.
With doves on it.
But after all, they were only middle-aged people, though their struggles had made them feel old.
The end of his journey grew near, and he began to experience some uneasiness at the thought of their reunion.
He had been corresponding with a sweetheart. Would she still be there in The Mother and Housewife?
He was afraid of finding himself cheated when he got home.
He did not want to see her holding a dishcloth or with children clinging to her skirts when he embraced her.
They must meet at some other place, alone.
Suppose he asked her to join him in Vauxhall at the inn where they had spent so many happy hours when they were engaged.
That was a good idea.
There, for a couple of days, they could recapture the memory of that first, long-past, happy springtime of theirs, which would never return. He sat down and put his suggestion to her in a long, passionate letter.
To which she replied in the affirmative, delighted because the same idea had occurred to him as to her.
2 days later, he arrived in Vauxhall and booked a room at the inn.
It was a beautiful September day.
It was so light and airy here. Outside, the stretches of water between the islands were as blue as ever. Only the birch trees along the shores had turned color.
He drank his coffee on the veranda and began to wait for the steamer, which would arrive at 6 o'clock. At last, he saw a column of smoke rising above the pine woods.
He had a mild attack of palpitations and drank liqueur, after which he walked down to the waterside.
Now he could see the flag on the foremast. Was she on the boat, or had she been prevented from coming? If the least little thing had gone wrong with one of the children, it would have been enough to keep her at home.
The children, who during the past weeks had receded into the background, now emerged as something that could stand between him and her.
He could now see people moving about on the upper deck, and sailors busy with ropes up at the prow.
The steamer blows its siren and makes signals.
Its engine slows down and it glides up to the jetty.
He can see her now.
Oh, and they exchange greetings with their eyes, for they're still too far away from each other to speak.
The boat comes alongside.
He sees her slowly push her way along the gangway. It is she, yet it is not she. Many years lie between.
Fashions have changed. The cut of her clothes is not the same.
It was she, yet it was not she.
He embraced her, and he kissed her.
They asked each other how they were.
And he, how the children were.
And then they walked up the hill from the shore.
Their words sounded awkward, dry, forced.
How odd. It was as if they would die of each other.
At last he plucked up the courage.
Shall we go for a walk before the sun goes down?
Oh, yes, please, she replied and took his arm.
They walked up the street that led into the little town.
All the summer cottages were shuttered and closed, and their gardens plundered.
It looked so autumnal.
Yes, it's strange to see the summer cottages looking like this.
They strolled on.
Let's go and look at the house we lived in.
Yes, that would be fun.
And they walked on.
There lay their little cottage.
Oh, there was its red fence and its veranda with the steps leading to the garden.
Memories of former times rose to the surface.
There was the bedroom in which their first child had been born. Jubilation and rejoicing, song and youth.
There was the rose bush they had planted.
But the strawberry bed they had made had gone. It had become overgrown and was now used as a lawn.
On the ash trees were the marks of the swing, but it too was no longer there.
Thank you for your beautiful letters.
They turned and went back to the hotel, and he gave her the details of his journey. He asked for a table to be laid in the big dining room.
But their table, the one at which they had usually sat in the old days.
They were soon involved in a tete-a-tete that sounded like a duet.
Each voice chiming in here with a word.
There with a memory.
Oh, for they were living on their memories.
Their eyes shone, and the lines on their faces were smoothed away.
Oh, that golden rose-colored time, which only comes once to anyone if it comes at all, and which many, many people never experience.
As they were having their sweet, he whispered something to the waitress,
who came back a minute or two later with a bottle of champagne.
Oh, Henrik, dear, what are you thinking of?
Of the spring that is past but will return.
The hours slipped by.
They rose and went to have their coffee in the drawing room where there was a piano.
I wonder what my little ones are doing,
said his wife, as if she were just waking from a dream.
Sit down and sing for me, he said, opening the instrument.
What shall I sing? You know I haven't sung in years.
Yes, he knew, but he wanted a song now.
She sat down at the piano and struck a few preliminary chords. Oh.
It was the sort of cracked piano you find in restaurants, with a tone that sounded like the rattle of false teeth.
What shall I sing?
You know, I'm sure, Lily.
And she began to sing, "Name me the land where my beloved dwells."
When her song was over, she did not dare to turn round for a few moments, as if she had expected him to come to her and say something.
But he did not come, and the room was silent.
When she swung around, he was sitting on the sofa, weeping. She wanted to jump up, to go to him, to take his head in her hands and kiss it as of old.
But she stayed where she was, motionless, with her eyes fixed on the floor.
Thank you, Lily. Will you have your coffee now?
They drank coffee and talked about summer cottages in general and where they should go next year.
But their conversation began to dry up, and they repeated themselves.
I think I'll go to bed now.
Yes, I'll do the same, she said, getting up, but I'd like to go out a bit first, onto the balcony.
He went into their bedroom.
His wife stopped for a while in the dining room and chatted to the landlady about pickling onions and washing woolens. When she found her way back, she paused outside the bedroom door.
All was quiet inside, and his boots were outside the door.
She knocked, but no one answered.
She opened the door and went in.
He was asleep.
He was asleep.
The next morning, they were sitting at the breakfast table.
He had a headache and she was looking uncomfortable.
Ugh, what horrid coffee.
It's Brazilian.
Well, what shall we do today, he said.
Well, you'd better eat something instead of sitting there fretting about the coffee.
He got a plate of sandwiches and a bottle of aquavite and cheered up. Now we'll go up to Pilot Rock and look at the view.
The weather was perfect, and the walk did them good.
But when it came to climbing the rock, it was heavy going.
Oh, she got out of breath.
And his knees were stiff.
They made no comparisons with the past.
After that, they walked out towards the open country.
The meadows had long since been mowed and then grazed, so that there was not a single flower to be seen.
They each sat down on a stone.
He began to talk about prison inspection and his work.
And she talked about the children.
Then they walked on a little way without talking. He took out his watch.
Let's see. 3 hours to dinner time, he said.
And he thought,
what on earth shall we do tomorrow?
Dinner was pretty silent.
At last she started on the chapter headed Maids.
For God's sakes, don't let's talk about maids.
Well, all right, but we haven't come here to quarrel.
Quarrel? Have I quarreled?
Well, I certainly haven't.
And then there was a dreadful pause.
He would have been glad of an intervention of some kind.
From the children?
Yes, this tete-a-tete was getting on his nerves.
But let's go to the slope where the oaks are and pick wild strawberries.
There won't be any strawberries now, my love. It's autumn, remember?
Let's go all the same.
So they set off again. But they couldn't get a conversation going.
He looked about for some object, some place that they could talk about. But everything was arid, used up.
She knew his views on everything.
And disapproved of most of them.
Moreover, he was longing to get back to his children, to his home.
Finally they stopped, for his wife was tired.
He sat down and wished that she would give him the chance to speak his mind.
What are you thinking about? She said at last.
I? Oh, why, this is what I was thinking. We're old, Mama. We've had our fun, and we ought to be content with what we've had. If you think the same, we'll go home on the evening boat. What about it?
Oh, that's what I've been thinking all the time, dear old man. But I thought you'd best have your way.
Good. Come along, then. We'll go home. It's not summer any longer. It's autumn.
Yes, it's autumn.
They trod on air as they walked back.
When they got back to the hotel, she immediately started to pack their portmanteau, and then she too was in her element.
Once on board the steamer, they made straight for the dining saloon.
And when they had supper, he helped himself first.
And she asked the waitress how much the bread cost.
Now the enchantment was quite broken.
The last vestige of the mistress had vanished.
He was sitting alone with the mother of his children.
Their journey was over.
When they reached home again, and he saw her in the midst of her children,
he soon realized that his liking for her had undergone a transformation.
And that her liking for him had been transferred to and distributed among all these little noisemongers.
Perhaps he had only had her liking as a means to an end. His role was so transitory.
That was why he felt displaced.
If he had not been needed as a breadwinner, he would probably have been discarded.
He went into his study, put on his dressing gown and slippers, lit his pipe, and felt that he was home again.
outside the wind lashed the rain, and the pipes of the Dutch oven whistled.
It's no weather for gathering wild strawberries.
No, the summer is over and it's autumn.
Yes, it's autumn. But it's not winter yet, and that's a comfort.
A comfort. Cold comfort when one can only live once.
Twice when one has children, 3 times if you have a chance to see your grandchildren.
True, but that really is the end.
Yes, unless there's another life after this.
But there's no certainty of that. Who knows? I believe there is, but my belief isn't proof.
I know, but it's nice to believe it. Let's believe it. Let's believe that there can be a second spring for us too. Let's believe it.
Yes, we'll believe it,
he said,
and put his arm around her waist.
Well, have you a clear idea now of what I mean?
Yes, quite clear enough.
No misunderstandings. That's good.
Yes. Sir, you're a socialist.
Of course, all enlightened people are today.
But sir, your attack on the woman question is inexplicable considering that you are yourself a radical.
Quite so. I have attacked woman's attempt to emancipate herself from childbearing, not her attempts to emancipate herself from the cradle and the kitchen. And now listen and write this down. I have attacked marriage under present conditions today in 1884. I have shown that perfect bliss is impossible. I have shown that under present conditions, and please write this down. I have attacked the people who have made woman what she is, the marriage that is sanctioned by the church and the form of emancipation invented by men, gallantry. That is, I have not attacked woman. I have attacked, in capital letters, please, present conditions. Woman does not need me to defend her. She is the mother and the ruler of the world. And the freedom she is demanding is the same freedom that all we men demand too. We must get it together, not as enemies, but as friends. Do you understand me now?